God's story, your life. Unfolding short stories.
Have you ever felt a strong nudge from God? That's what happened to Mark Winter. A simple invitation to a prayer meeting became the start of a powerful series of steps towards reconciliation in his life. God was preparing to heal Mark's heart, but it starts with a need for God to heal Mark's body.
Well, it was 1994, and I was pastoring a church in a small town in Texas. And one afternoon, a colleague from another congregation in town, he knocked on the parsonage door, and he told me that he had heard I was scheduled for back surgery. And he said, "Hey, I want you to come over because I have some deacons that want to pray for you." And so it was a gray, blustery day in October, and I walked to the meeting spot, and I was very hopeful. I was hoping God would use the prayers of these men to heal my back. And my back was not healed that day, but something far more important was. That was my relationship with my father. So I sat down in a chair, and the men gathered around me. They laid hands on my shoulder, and they began to pray for me. I wasn't expecting this at all, but it was like a dam broke open in me, and tears began to flow out of me as I unexpectedly began to pour out years of trauma in front of these men. And I was confessing my hatred toward my dad. When I was growing up, I could never predict which dad would come home from work. I mean, sometimes he was in a great mood. He would take the family out for ice cream. But other times he'd come home raging like a thunderstorm. His belt wasn't just a form of discipline. It was just brutal punishment driven by a rage that left deep emotional scars with me and my sisters. I endured years of this: physical abuse, mental abuse, verbal abuse. And as you could imagine, the resentment grew inside of me like a poison. And even into adulthood, my dad was making cutting remarks to me, sometimes in front of my congregation members, and he would disguise it as humor, but it wasn't funny to me. And eventually, I distanced myself from him. I believed that cutting contact off with him would somehow protect me. Well, he was retired at this point, and I think he was trying to reach out to me in his own way, and he would call me just to talk, but I didn't want to talk to him. I maintained my emotional distance. I would always make excuses to cut the conversation short. And in the meantime, I continued to swim in all these painful memories of my childhood, and I would rehearse these scenes where my dad hurt me or embarrassed me. And the bitterness in my soul, it just kept growing like a weed. Well, I poured all this out to these men who were praying for me. And after finishing my story with tears just streaming down my face, and by the way, I didn't cry much as a grown man, and especially didn't want to cry in front of these guys. But there I was, just blubbering like a baby. And one of the men asked me to stand up. And then he just wrapped these bare arms around me and just held me for a few moments. And he said, "Is this what you missed from your dad? Your dad just hugging you and loving on you?" And his question hit me very deeply. And right there, I found the strength to forgive my dad. And it felt like a 1,000-pound weight had rolled off my shoulders. Well, I was walking home. I thought I was free, but God had some other plans for me. I heard God speak to me. Now, it wasn't an audible voice. It's hard to describe, but the words came suddenly into my mind like a neon sign had been turned on. And the words were very clear: "Call your father and hurry." And the words repeated over and over: "Call your father and hurry." Well, as a pastor who preached on forgiveness and taught on forgiveness, you would think that I immediately called my dad and offered forgiveness. But no, I didn't. I put God off, kind of like I had been putting my dad off, but God kept nudging me hard. And finally I called, and I was very nervous. I felt like a 10-year-old kid again. Well, I decided to get right to the point. I told my dad what had happened to the prayer meeting. I told him that I felt God wanted me to call him, and I told him that I forgave him for all these years of pain. And in his Texas drawl, Dad said, "Son, I'm glad you called. We're mending fences. Why don't we have a fresh start, you and me?" Well, this was like a dream come true. I couldn't believe it. For the next 30 minutes, we went deep. Dad admitted that he regretted many things that he did to me and my sisters as a child, but he said, "Man, I was just doing what my own father had done to me." He didn't know any other way. Well, I listened with my heart, and I realized that my father had been carrying his own load of pain all these years. He had been shaped by a legacy of hurt that he didn't know how to break, and he passed down what he himself had endured. And in that moment, I felt compassion toward him. I saw not just the man who hurt me, but I saw the wounded child in him as well. Well, for the first time, I truly understood that he too had been the victim of a cycle he hadn't chosen, but simply inherited. And though it didn't excuse what he had done, it helped me see him through a new lens, one that allowed me to forgive and move on. But after all that, I blurted something out that I hadn't expected to say. I said, "Dad, would you forgive me?" And I thought, where did that come from? And my dad seemed surprised too. He said, "Forgive you for what?" I said, "Well, for hating you for so long, for not reaching out and trying to get this thing right, to reconcile." Well, my dad seemed a little embarrassed, but he agreed to forgive me. And by the end of that call, I think we both had a deeper peace than we ever imagined we could have, knowing that this conversation had freed us both. And then, and right before we hung up, I said, "Dad, a man gave me a big hug today in this prayer meeting, and I want to hug you now every time that I see you." Our relationship wasn't very physical. And he chuckled and said, "Well, son, I'm not used to grown men hugging me, but I'll make an exception with you." So I hung up the phone, and I thank God for an amazing morning. Then 3 hours later, my mother called, and her voice was soaked in tears. She had told me that my father had passed away suddenly, dying at home of a heart attack. Well, of course, every time I think of my dad, I'm grateful for those final words we shared and for God's persistence in pushing me toward that phone call. Most of all, I'm glad that God turned the tables on me and nudged me to ask my dad for forgiveness, to heal the parts of my heart I didn't even know were broken. That simple call, that one call I almost didn't make, became the most important conversation of my life. And it taught me that forgiveness isn't just a gift that we give. Sometimes it's a gift we need to receive, even when it's unexpected.
Call your father and hurry. When Mark and I met and he first shared this story with me, I had no idea of the twist that was to come, the timing of it all. It's hard to believe how close this whole series of events was to the end of Mark's dad's life. It was 3 hours. But so many amazing God stories are like that. You know, as I reflected on this story, I had 2 thoughts that came to mind that I wanted to share with you. The first is that this entire story started with the prompting of someone else. It wasn't Mark's idea. It was a pastor friend who invited him for prayer. Then it was a man at that prayer that embraced Mark. He gave him that hug that Mark was craving. And all of this healing happened outside of the prompting of Mark. So to me, it just emphasizes God's pursuit of Mark. While Mark was receiving prayer, it was God showering Mark with love. And then after that, God continues to speak to Mark, not audibly, but like a repeat message. telling Mark to call his dad. For Mark, this remains one of the most amazing stories of God's love and faithfulness that he carries with him. Here's the second thought I had. One day, I think Mark's going to get that hug from his father. Hey, if you ever want to tell us about something amazing that God has done in your life, please reach out to Meredith Foster and the rest of our Unfolding team. The Unfolding is a Wow God production. Discover more at wowgod.com.